So how hard is it to adopt an embryo? I mean, it's not hard, but it's not easy either. If you're wondering that, stick around because that's what we're going to talk about in this episode. What's up? I'm Corlandos Scott, and I'm an assisted reproductive technologies attorney in Los Angeles, so that means my practice revolves around assisted reproduction and methods like embryo adoption at that. So in this episode, we're going to talk about how easy it is or isn't to adopt an embryo. We'll talk about the availability of embryos, we'll talk about the process for adopting embryos, and we'll even look at the cost and the requirements. Let's dive right in. Throughout my career, I've been fortunate to, at this point, have been involved in over 1,000 surrogacy, egg donation, assisted reproduction journeys in general. And I'll admit, there's only been a handful of couples who have proactively decided on donating their embryos when they were going through the initial phase. However, that doesn't mean that most couples who go through the IVF process or other assisted reproductive processes, they don't have leftover embryos sitting on ice somewhere. Now, most of the time, if someone does donate their embryos, it's donation to medical research. They just simply say, okay, clinic, you can keep them and do what you need to do with them. Or they typically opt to have them destroyed instead. And there's also even instances where those who initially agreed to donate or expressed a willingness to donate their unused frozen embryos later change their mind and decide, that wasn't exactly for us. We thought it was at the time, but right now it's a little different when we're actually looking at making that happen. And there's no judgment for that because everything in assisted reproductive technologies really, although it has a very, very scientific foundation, is a very emotional process. And most people are simply not comfortable with the idea of donating their embryos to other couples because of what it would mean to their own children or the resulting child, or especially if the intended parents who may be willing to donate also were the ones who use their genes to create the embryos. Sometimes people even have hangups around what it would mean to them as a parent, seeing that they use their own genetics to create the embryos. Some of them could be thinking, genetically, I'll have other children out there in the world. And if you're not already a donor who's thinking those things, it may be a lot to swallow or to consider when you're thinking about donating your embryos. Now, this isn't to say that things look grim. That's not to paint a bad picture of your chances for being able to adopt an embryo, because we do have options. And with the growing number of people receiving IVF treatments and embryos being created and cryopreserved, it's an option for sure. Let's say that each person that goes through IVF has an average of 5 embryos, and only 1 or 2 of those 5 embryos are actually used, and the rest are frozen or cryopreserved in fertility clinics or cryobanks. Can you imagine how many embryos remain in storage? And possibly some of them never to see the light of day. And they won't be thawed, they won't be transplanted into a surrogate or into any other woman's uterus. Now, on one hand, that seems like we have a big problem, but there's also good news. And that means that there is a supply out there that's available to be donated and adopted, so to speak. And there are embryo donation agencies out there specifically established for the purpose of matching potential parents to embryo donors. So let's talk about that adoption process. What's the first thing you need to know? Well, embryo adoption is a little bit different than embryo donation, although they both are very similar. When you are working with an agency who views embryo adoption as adoption, then it creates a little bit of a different process. Embryo adoption agencies typically view the process like the adoption of a child. And because of this view, in order to adopt an embryo through these types of facilities or agencies, the recipients or the intended parents must go through a rigorous screening process, just like in the adoption context. So how does this work? Well, the donors in this sense, they select the recipients or the intended parents and not the other way around. Now, some agencies require the recipients, or we call them intended parents also, to complete a home study, a comprehensive background check, Even things done that you would typically have to do for a state licensed adoption agency or a social worker, they still want you to do this for the embryo adoption process. And then there's the legal contract that's drafted between the donor and the recipients. And that's not all. There's also a financial component to this process, like everything else with assisted reproduction. But before we talk about the financial component of it, have you ever wondered how to get notifications when I release a new video? Oh, let me tell you, you just click that little bell that's right beside the subscribe button and it'll let you know. YouTube, they're smart like that. So just go ahead, take a second, subscribe, like, and even click the bell so you know when I release new videos. Now let's talk about those financial components. When we're looking at the financial components of embryo adoption, we can look at it from a few different angles. First, let's look at the financial capabilities of the recipients. We want to make sure, and these agencies will want to make sure, that you have the ability or the capability to care for a child and provide for all of the child's needs growing up, like food, shelter, education, health, all those kinds of things. Remember, these agencies view the embryo adoption process much like the process of adopting a child. And any adoption agency would want to know, are the prospective adopting parents capable of providing for that child? There's also a financial cost around the medical screening. You want to test and screen the embryos if they have not been tested for any abnormalities or genetic defects or any kind of illnesses or issues like that. Now let's look at the time component. I really still consider this one of the costs because, you know, like they say, time is money, but really it is an emotional cost as well because the length of the process does wear or could weigh you down. So the process can go on from a few months to even a year. How long it takes will depend on a few things. You know, the adequacy of the information you provide, getting through the paperwork process and all of the applications, the medical, the psychological screenings, going through the background checks and checking for the reviews of the information that the agency needs in order to proceed. Also, the time it takes to go through the legal process. So there's definitely a cost associated with the time. But this cost, when we're talking about pure dollars and cents, it could range anywhere from $6,000 to $15,000, and that's not including the cost of the medical procedures that are involved. This is simply what it may cost you to work with an agency and do all of the things that the agency will require you to do to be matched with the recipient or matched with the donor and to take possession of those donated embryos. But like everything else in life, where there's a cost, there should also be a benefit. And there is a benefit to embryo adoption. The biggest benefit, I'd say, is the success rate. So you have to remember, when you're looking at going through the embryo adoption process, you're working with embryos that have likely already gone through the medical screening process, already deemed healthy. They were already a part of a larger group of embryos that probably resulted in a successful birth. So you can have peace of mind that you're a little bit closer to successfully growing your family through assisted reproduction when you go through the embryo adoption process. And when you're doing embryo adoption, you're cutting out all the things that had to come before, like all the IVF procedures and the costs associated with that. So embryo adoption, although it may take time, although there are still costs associated with it, it's an amazing alternative and an amazing approach to growing your family through assisted reproduction. If you're thinking about growing your family through assisted reproduction, specifically surrogacy, and you're looking for where to start, I have something just for you. I call it the Surrogacy Roadmap. And it is a diagram that walks you through all of the steps of the surrogacy process from beginning to end. And I even give you a video walkthrough where I take you through each of the steps, letting you know what you can expect. First, second, third, first to last. So if you want that, just look below in the description box, click the link, get the Surrogacy Roadmap, and you'll be well on your way to growing your family the smart way through surrogacy. See you in the next episode.